For a city of its size, and with the amount of car-based urban design it has, Perth, Western Australia actually has a surprisingly good public transport network. That's not to say it's amazing, but it is better than you might expect. The transport network is made up of three main modes. First, there's the train network, which, while not particularly extensive, does provide a pretty interesting case study in how you can build a successful rail network in more car-dependent urban areas. Second, there's the quite extensive bus network, which has earned a fair bit of praise from transit enthusiasts for Transperth's efforts to introduce all-day high-frequency bus routes along key corridors. And while between them the first two modes make up the bulk of Perth's public transport ridership, Transperth does operate a third mode, one that tends to get far less attention: ferries. Perth's ferry network is small. It's literally just one line that runs between two stops, from Men's Street Jetty along the South Perth foreshore to Elizabeth Quay Jetty in the Perth Central Business District or CBD, a journey that just takes 10 minutes. But it could be about to get a lot bigger. Just a couple of days ago, Western Australian State Premier Roger Cook announced that the government was looking into expanding the network. Perth has seen a lot of transport expansion in recent years as part of its Metronet project, which has seen the construction of multiple new train lines and rail extensions. And when talking about his plans for the ferry network, the Premier described them as Metronet on the Swan. In the announcement, the Premier suggested there could be new routes running to new stops at Crown Casino, Claisebrook Cove, Optus Stadium, Belmont Park, Canning Bridge, Applecross, and even the University of Western Australia at Matilda Bay. That said, this project is still in very early stages, with the business case currently underway. But could such a system actually be successful? There have been previous studies into building out Perth's ferry network that have suggested it might not be such a good use of money. Now, one of the benefits of building a ferry network is that it's not overly expensive to build. You don't need to acquire rights of way or lay miles of track or even bore large tunnels. You basically just need to build the wharves and buy the boats. But even with the lower construction costs, the system will still need enough ridership to justify its initial price tag and the costs of running it. Now, Perth's current ferry system might be small, but for its size it has somewhat decent ridership. This past January it had over 100,000 boardings, more than double the same period last year. Although the state was running a free public transport promotion that month, which might have helped. I have a separate video on that if you're interested. What also probably helps is that South Perth is relatively dense, having quite a number of apartment blocks, and is the location of the Perth Zoo, which is a significant tourist attraction. Both these things will help drive ridership, especially considering there is no rail access from South Perth to the CBD, so the ferry to Elizabeth Quay, which is a major transport interchange in its own right, is able to fill that gap. On top of that, the ferry runs every 15 minutes, giving it basically a turn-up-and-go service. But while the ferry network is just a single line today, it used to be much larger. Before the opening of the Fremantle Railway line in the late 1800s, many people who wanted to make the trip from Fremantle to Perth had to rely on ferries. And as the city grew, ferry wharves sprang up all across the river, in places like North Fremantle, Preston Point, Coode Street, and even as far east as Guildford. Up until the 1870s, ferries were basically the only form of public transport in the growing city. However, as trains and trams, then later buses and cars, began to get introduced, the ferry network began to shrink, leaving us with the single South Perth to Elizabeth Quay line we have today. But many people in Perth will look at the Swan River, this large, open and calm body of water, and wonder why we don't make more use of it. They might even travel somewhere like Sydney, for example, and see how their harbour forms an important part of their transport network. Even similarly sized Brisbane, whose river is far narrower than the Swan River, operates a significantly more extensive ferry system. So, could something similar work for Perth? Well, let's go back to Sydney for a second, because that is the city most people think of when they think of ferries in Australia. And the Sydney Harbour offers a semi-good point of comparison with the Swan River, both being very large and open as opposed to narrower and snaky like the river in Brisbane. Sydney manages to run a pretty extensive network with 10 different ferry lines and an annual ridership across the network of about 15 million pre-pandemic. That said, even with those numbers, as a transport mode it does still fall very far behind Sydney's other modes, accounting for less than 3% of public transport trips made. Now, geographically speaking, Sydney Harbour does seem like the ideal place to build a ferry network. As I said before, it's large and open. Also, Sydney CBD is located fairly centrally in the middle of it. But perhaps most importantly, it has loads of peninsulas and coves that often make journeys by water substantially shorter than the equivalent journey by land. Perth's river, on the other hand, has a much smoother shoreline, so the distances for travelling by water are generally not that much shorter than the land route. For a, in fairness, somewhat extreme example of this, someone in Sydney who lives at the tip of the Woolwich Peninsula would need to travel more than twice the distance by car to reach the Sydney CBD than they would if they made the journey by boat. Compare that with a boat trip in Perth from Dalkeith to Elizabeth Quay, where the water route is slightly shorter, but because of the smoother shoreline, it's not to the same extent. That said, not every route in Sydney has such extreme distance savings anyway. The most popular ferry route, which runs from Circular Quay to Manly, is a shorter distance by water, but not by a whole lot. But without the savings in distance, another major benefit of ferries is that they don't get stuck in traffic. And in the case of the Manly ferry, its journey time is about 20 minutes, which is quite a bit quicker than the road option, especially in peak hour where the drive takes an average of 50 minutes. Beyond just the time savings, there are other things that make the Manly ferry so popular aside from just tourism, that Perth could learn from for its potential ferry network. One thing is that the area around Manly Wharf, like the area around Main Street Jetty in South Perth, has a lot of apartments, meaning a lot of people are able to live a walkable distance from the wharf. In contrast, if a route were to be run from Perth CBD to Applecross, which is one of the routes the Premier suggested, well, a lot of Applecross is just single-family homes, and the number of people who would be in walking distance from, say, the existing Applecross jetty would be pretty small. Adding to that, the Swan River can be pretty shallow, so it can be quite a long distance away from the shore before the water becomes deep enough for a ferry-sized boat to be able to navigate. Ferry wharves already have an issue where a substantial amount of their catchment, aka the area where people can comfortably walk to the wharf, is taken up by water. And the further away from the shore you need to move the wharf, the fewer people the wharf will be able to serve. Now to me, this just highlights that if Perth goes ahead with this ferry network, building density around the wharves will become even more important, to ensure the limited walkable area around the wharf is made good use of. And it does seem like the state government is aware of that. The report released alongside the announcement of the ferry network plans does mention that, where older reports had advised against network expansion, doing it as new high-density nodes are developed along the riverfront would make the project easier to justify. That said, another thing we can take from Sydney's Manly ferry is the importance of connecting buses. Even with the density around Manly's ferry wharf, part of how it achieves its solid ridership numbers is that it's also a major bus hub. This means commuters not within walking distance of the wharf can still get the benefit of the fast travel times into the city. And importantly, the Manly ferry runs every 15 minutes. That's not including the private fast ferry service, meaning the bus passengers don't have to worry too much about long wait times when making their transfers. Ultimately, I quite like the idea of Perth expanding its ferry network, if only because of the fact the Swan River is a beautiful place to get around by boat. That said, I am interested to know if you all think the same. Let me know in a comment if you think it would be a good use of money. In my view, while Perth has relatively suitable geography, there are some substantial challenges that will need to be overcome to actually make it successful. But if Perth can work on the density around the stops, as well as set up a network of feeder bus services, I think these challenges can be overcome so that the network becomes more than just a glorified tourist shuttle and actually forms a meaningful part of Perth's transport network. Well, as always, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider giving it a like and subscribing if you haven't already. And of course, I'm City Moose, thanks for watching.